Welcome to Host Directed, a two-part miniseries that will explore the need for antivirals to treat severe respiratory disease. Brought to you by Synergen, the respiratory company developing SNG-001, an investigational formulation for inhalation containing the broad-spectrum antiviral protein interferon beta to treat or prevent severe viral lung infections. For more information about Synergen, visit synergen.com. I'm Dr. David Canty, your host for Host Directed. In our last episode, we discussed the fact that not all antivirals are the same and explored the need for broad-spectrum medicines to help stop viral infection. In this episode, we'll continue to explore antivirals with a discussion focused on understanding the broad-spectrum antiviral protein interferon beta. To discuss this topic, I have the pleasure of hosting Professor Ratko Jukanovic, co-founder of Synergen and professor of medicine at University of Southampton and director, Southampton Center for Biomedical Research. We will also have Richard Marsden, CEO of Synergen. Professor Jukanovic, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. So to kick things off, please give us a little more information about your background and your research on antivirals.
Well, thank you. So I'm professor of medicine, but my specialty is pulmonary medicine. And my particular interest is in chronic airways diseases, asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so COPD. And of course, these two conditions, which form a spectrum of diseases, they're not a single disease. They exacerbate every so often. And the main cause of exacerbations, in other words, deteriorations when patients become much more breathless, the main cause is viruses. And there's a whole spectrum of viruses. And when they strike within the lungs of these patients, they cause increased inflammation, constriction of the bronchial tubes. And of course, that leads to breathing problems, which sometimes sadly require admission. So we did all kinds of studies. And of course, in and amongst those studies was the one we did with interferon beta, which we'll be talking about in a moment.
I wanted to ask you, and especially for our audience as well, could you tell us just what is interferon beta?
So interferon beta is something that we all produce. It is a protein produced by the epithelial cells. These are the lining cells that line the inside of our bronchial tree. And indeed, already in the nose, we start producing interferon beta as soon as the immune system recognizes that a virus has penetrated its space. We're born with it, innate immunity. The problem is that as we age or as we develop certain chronic conditions, in particular lung diseases, the ability of our epithelial cells to produce interferon is reduced. That is what makes those individuals at higher risk of developing more severe infections.
So interferon beta is naturally occurring, probably a member of the cytokine family, the total cytokine family. What happens when a virus comes in and infects the lungs? What is the interferon doing then?
So interferon is induced as soon as the virus comes in. And the key outcome is that the cell, guided by interferon beta, undergoes a process called apoptosis, which in plain English means programmed cell death. When you have apoptosis, the cell shrivels up. It retains the virus within the cell. And then this dead cell is then gobbled up, eaten by a process called phagocytosis by professional cells that we have in the lungs. The key mechanism is this almost like a kamikaze mission that our epithelial cells undergoes in order to stop the virus from spreading.
One of the things I was wondering about is why is an inhaled form of interferon beta needed? Because, given that there's already an injectable version available, what's the big advantage to having it inhalable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what you need is to get the right concentration of the drug where it's needed. The best way to get the right concentration without overwhelming the whole body is to deliver the interferon beta by inhalation.
What is it that really excites you about that potential therapy?
Okay, so what excites me is that it's a very broad antiviral agent. So we've tested it in the laboratory with a whole series of viruses. To begin with the rhinovirus, which is the common cold virus. We also looked at how well it was tolerated. When you give something by inhalation, especially for people who've got irritable airways, there's a certain twitchiness within the lungs. So at best, it causes a cough, or sometimes in people with asthma, it causes constriction of the bronchial tubes. But none of that was noted with interferon beta, because the way we formulated it was very carefully done so as to get the right acidity so that it's tolerated very well.
I would imagine, given what you seem to be describing as a very broad activity of the drug, that there potentially could be a number of different patient population groups that would be appropriate.
We're still very much interested in using it in severe viral illness that results in patients deteriorating to the point that they need hospital admission, especially those who are at higher risk. So people with chronic cardiovascular disease, diabetes, who are obese, elderly, and in people who have some form of immunodeficiency, where the hope is then that by giving them interferon beta, we would give them enough time, would buy the time for their weakened immune response then to throw its weight into the mix.
So with that as a background, what are the next steps in developing SNG-001? Where do you see it going from here?
We will be conducting further proof of concept studies in severe viral infections. So we're talking to a number of colleagues around the globe, and there's a lot of interest for that. So watch the space.
Well, Professor Djukanovic, thank you many times over for taking the time to share your experience and your insights with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much as well. Thank you.
Our next guest to take this discussion further is Richard Marsden, CEO of Synergen. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing at Synergen.
Well, my background is quite broad. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry since I was in my 20s, which is quite a long time ago now. And I've had various roles, from commercial roles through to project management, clinical trial management, medical devices. And I joined Synergen just over 15 years ago, really as an all-rounder, but I am surrounded by experts, whether it's scientists, clinical developers, manufacturing and formulation scientists, finance, everything.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Synergen, the company, and its mission?
The academic founders of the company, two of whom are medical doctors, had a long-standing interest in the way common respiratory viruses, and this is the common cold virus and the flu virus, filled their wards up. So they were coupling up their interest in trying to work out why these viruses were making their patients who are asthma and COPD patients very poorly every winter. And the other half of the story is that the scientists had developed a technology where they collected cells from volunteers who had lung disease and people who had no disease at all as controls for these experiments. And they discovered that these cells from people with asthma, people with COPD, and also older people don't make enough interferon beta fast enough when there's a virus around. It provides a hypothesis as to why these patient groups are getting into trouble with these viruses.
I've heard you talk about interferon beta, orchestrating the immune system. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing for just one molecule to do, but it appears to be, multifaceted in how it addresses viral infections.
All viruses, think of them like a parasite. They want to jump into a cell, take over the machinery of that cell, to turn that cell into a virus factory. And when those cells are infected, they naturally make interferon beta, and other cells make interferon beta.
We've also learned a lot about the needs of patients in hospital settings. Is that where you see a broad spectrum antiviral coming into play?
So the aim here is to have drugs available so that when somebody is hospitalized with breathing difficulties and where a viral infection is confirmed, that you give the drug irrespective of which virus they've got, with the aim of preventing a further deterioration of their disease, and to get them out of hospital and potentially to reduce things like readmission rates as well.
And that's kind of, the whole approach of host targeted or host directed as opposed to viral directed. Have I got that right?
That's right. So there are some drugs which are, very good drugs, which are designed to just trip up a certain virus. And oseltamivir is a really good example of that. A drug that is targeted against flu, and it just interferes with something that virus needs to do in order to replicate. Whereas our drug is different. We're harnessing and boosting and switching on a perfectly intact and really good defense system that isn't being switched on properly because this key protein, interferon beta, isn't being made locally in sufficient quantities to drive that strong antiviral response.
What an incredibly exciting time it must be at Synergen. And, not only now, but looking ahead to the future and the potential. It's just astounding.
I think the main thing is it's the clinical need that drives the company. We've got medical doctors around the company. We've got nurses in the company and scientists who've worked in life sciences for a long time. And every year viruses put patients in hospital, and then we're always worried about the potential of a new threat such as SARS-CoV-2. So that's the main driver, to get this drug into the next stage of clinical trials to take it towards the marketplace.
Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's been very informative and very educational, and we really appreciate it. This concludes our mini-series, Host Directed. To learn more, visit Synergen.com. Thank you for joining us, and breathe easy.